Lloyd Kiva was really a pathbreaker in Native fashion and education. He was Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, but spent most of his adult life and career in the Southwest.
Lloyd was born near Fairland, Oklahoma, and he grew up on a farm called Timber Hill, which is near the Osiyo River. As a child, Lloyd was always drawn to the arts. He recalls making his own pigment from clays found on the farm. His mother and father actually would speak Cherokee to each other, but they didn't teach the children because at the time they thought that was a sign of, not being progressive. If you spoke the language, they wanted the children to have a better life than they did. So he talks about lamenting the fact that he didn't learn the language as a child. He was very interested in painting, drawing, sculptures. It wasn't until later in life when he got into the fashion and fabrics. He enrolled in Oklahoma A&M College, which would become Oklahoma State University. But he did take some classes in home economics, and that's where he was first exposed to the idea of fabrics. He learned how to identify different fabrics for men's clothing, and that kind of set that spark for him to eventually enter fashion. He wound up quitting Oklahoma A&M just because of lack of interest, and he wanted to find a different direction. He kind of went through a depression, and his mother and sister were really concerned about it. They went to Muskogee to visit the Indian agent there at the office of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they asked if they could give a student loan for him to go to the Art Institute in Chicago. And they did it, and so that's how he wound up going there, and that's where he got his art education to become an arts educator himself. After he graduated from Chicago, he moved to Phoenix to begin teaching, and then that's when he got caught up in the war. But after the war, he returned to the Phoenix area to kind of pick up where he left off, and he established his shop, his fashion shop, making the bags and things in Scottsdale, which at the time was starting to really develop into this center for lots of handcrafted items and things, and he was on the forefront of that. Lloyd was one of the first native fashion designers. But he was the first one to bring it to a very successful and popular venture where people would recognize that native designs and fashions were very unique and very valuable.
Just outside Phoenix, where a lot of galleries and artist studios were, that's where he and Charles Lolema first started collaborating in the Kiva studio in Scottsdale, Arizona in the 1950s. He really was an innovator in native fashion. He did things that people had never done before. And one of the things was incorporating images, designs, and traditions, not only from his own Cherokee background, but from the native backgrounds and traditions in the Southwest where he made his home. Aside from his innovation, his work and others became mainstream. So these cocktail dresses from the 1950s were available in high-end department stores in Denver, Los Angeles, and New York. It wasn't just in Santa Fe or in the Southwest, but they were really part of the mainstream American culture in these department stores in major cities all over the country. And he collaborated with many people as well. That was an important factor and influence in his work.
He reached back home. There was the Sequoia Weavers Association, which made a lot of their own textiles, and they were selling things to some of the same department stores. And so they had this partnership in which they would design and make textiles for him, and he would make the clothing and sell them to all these other places. They wound up showing their work at the Fashion Expo in New York City, so their work was gaining really large exposure. And that really caught the attention of not just that local area, but the world. People like Eleanor Roosevelt would come and buy things from him, and people like Frank Lloyd Wright as his friend, so he had a really great circle of people around him.
Both Lloyd Kiva and Charles Lolema were such innovators that many people here in the States, native and non-native, thought their designs and artwork and jewelry went too far and was so contemporary that it wasn't really native anymore. But when the two of them had this successful runway show in Paris in 1963, and the French raved about how creative and artistic their designs were, the Americans started to really take notice and say, oh, well, we like that stuff too. Looking at Lloyd New's career and the reaction of people to his work, we've been having this conversation for a long time. What is native art? How is it defined? And who is doing the defining? It really should be the native artists who are doing the defining.
At the height of his career as a designer, he had this international acclaim. And then he decided to refocus his efforts on Native arts education, and that was in the late 50s, early 60s. And soon after that, that's when he began planning IAIA, the establishment of the Institute for American Indian Arts. So he was an art director and then he became a president. He was an instructor. In this time, this was during the mid-20th century, people were recognizing that Native art was a very uniquely American thing. And I think trying to teach young artists to recognize that their own artworks and art forms were valid. The idea was to create a progressive model for Native students to go to where they could express themselves as Native people. As an arts educator, one of the biggest parts of his legacy is telling Native artists that you define what Native art is. There's this conception in the popular imagination of what Native art is supposed to be, but his philosophy was basically that as Native artists, we are Natives making art, and what we make is Native art.